Good afternoon, everyone. As many of you know, my name is Prue Klein and I'm the Marketing Coordinator here at Wine Communicators of Australia. Today's webinar will be presented by Angelica Crabb, Senior Analyst Wine Australia, and I know already I have said that wrong. She will reveal the latest results for Australian wine exports in the year ended March 2023, including the economic forces, the consumer preferences, the impacting on overall export performance, trends in traditional markets for Australian wine, and a spotlight on recent performance in emerging markets such as Southeast Asia. We have allowed plenty of time for any questions you may have to be answered at the end of the presentation. However, feel free to pop them in the Q&A, which the button is there at the bottom of your screen. As usual, this webinar will be recorded and a link to the recording sent to you 24 hours post live session, should you wish to watch the session again. It is now my pleasure to hand over to you, Angelica, for today's presentation. Hopefully I got it right that time.
Yes, all good. Thanks, Prue. Yes, hi, I'm Angelica. I'm a senior analyst in the Market Insights team at Wine Australia. And today I am going to be taking you through first the export performance basically of the last year. But I'll start with a sort of an overview of global wine supply and demand, just to give us a bit of context on what's going on globally. Then I'll talk through how that's affecting our export performance now in 2023. And I'll go into some detail about wine styles and price segments, as well as then by markets. So our traditional markets, and then as well as some emerging markets. So first of all, what is happening globally? So in the last few years, we've had pretty stable wine supply in the world, and then demand has been falling slightly year on year. So as you can see, while we have stable supply, we've actually had falling demand. So there's a gap there. There's an oversupply of wine in the world globally, and that is mostly in then that lower price segments and red wine. So moving then a little bit a bit more detail on the supply and what's happened in the last year or so. And you can see that France had a big vintage in 2022, but that's actually being outweighed by lower vintages for most of the southern hemisphere, as well as Spain and the US. Going back then to demand, this is global wine sales by volume and value. And you can see that, as I mentioned before, the volume of wine sales has been declining by about 1% year on year for the last 5 years. And on the other hand, you've got value growing. So what's driving that? We've got less wine drinkers in the world. That in most of the traditional markets, they're actually losing wine drinkers. And that's because of those health and wellness trends, competition from other beverages. And the reason that value is still growing is that you've got that premiumization trend, which is probably nothing new to the people on this call. It's where consumers are choosing to drink less wine, and when they do drink wine, they're spending more on it. So they're treating themselves basically. So those are the trends that are playing out here on this chart. What's driving that value growth is the premium end of the market. Now, it is currently still a very small part of the global wine market. It's about 14% of volume, but that has grown from 12% 5 years beforehand. So it's slowly growing, slowly taking away share from the commercial end of the market. So this is our latest vintage figures, which is actually from 2022. And you can see that we had this record vintage in 2021 that came down to near average in 2022. And we don't have the numbers for 23 yet, but it's likely to be smaller. Those figures will be released in July. But this big vintage in 21 and then the smaller 2022 vintage will play out in the export figures that I'm about to show you. So that's a bit of, that's the global context. Now, all of that is combining for a really difficult operating environment for Australian wine. So first of all, those global trends that I just talked about, the long-term decline of wine drinkers, health and wellness trends, and competition from other categories. The premiumization trend, well, it's not a bad thing. It does affect Australia's exports disproportionately to other source countries. And that is because a large percentage of what we export is actually in those more value price points. It is affecting us in some of our key markets, and I'll show you that in more detail in a bit. Obviously, we had the events of 2020, when we can't really forget about those. They're still impacting on what's happening now. We had the bushfires, we had COVID, we had the China tariffs hit. So that's all of that is still affecting some of what's going on. So we've had the aftermath, we've had the channel shifts. So in some of our key markets, Australia has a very large share of the off-trade. And so we really benefited from the on-trade closing in some of our key markets. So obviously we had growth during COVID, and then that's come off after COVID. We've had the shipping challenges. They were horrible, and they're still going on. There is some indications that that's easing on certain trade routes, but there are still some issues at some ports and some trade routes as well. Then, of course, we've got labor shortages here in Australia and abroad. So got all of that happening. Then we've also, on top of that, had that record size 2021 vintage, which came at the same time as all of the shipping challenges. So that really created this buildup of volume here in Australia. We couldn't get it out when we wanted to get it out to our overseas customers. Then you had rising inflation, and of course then rising interest rates. And that the impact of that is twofold. You've got increased cost of inputs for wineries, for grape growers, for retailers, for everyone in the industry. And then obviously you've got reduced disposable incomes for consumers as well. So they're having to choose then whether they want to drink wine or maybe something that's a little bit more essential to living. So that they're forcing them to make some tough decisions there. So all of these factors are really impacting on what's going on. So it's not a great situation. So turning towards where are we actually at? So the currently in March 2023, in the last 12 months, we've had exports decline by 7% in value and 1% in volume. So volume being a little bit more stable. And that's actually well below our 10-year averages. So you can see there on the screen, the 10-year average for volume is 736 million litres, and we're currently at 620. The 10-year average for value is 2.3 billion, and we're at 1.9 billion. So we're actually quite, that kind of just puts it in context of what we've seen in the last 10 years on average and where we are right now. And that's because of all the factors I just talked about. So just taking a bit of a longer term view, this is about the last 20 years of exports and to our main markets, and then I've grouped other Asia, other Europe, and the rest of the world together. And what you can see there, obviously, the China line does stand out. But the other thing that stands out is the decline just slowly happening over time to the US, to the UK. There have been some increases and declines there over time, a little bit of variability, but overall a decline since about the GFC. Then Canada and New Zealand have been a bit more stable, but I think the most interesting thing, aside from all that on this chart, is that other Asia line, which has actually overtaken Canada in the last few years. And that's all the Asian markets, excluding mainland China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, which are represented separately on the chart. So that's really just shows some of that market diversification, the growth of the emerging markets that's happening in our exports. Sorry. Okay, then looking a little bit by container type here, you can see the change from the longer term change from 2018 to now. You can see that decline in volume. And most of that is a loss in bottled wine. And there's a few factors playing into that. Obviously, 2018 was a large year of exports, and that was because we had a very big vintage in 2017. So exports naturally go up in most cases the year after. You can see that after the 2021 vintage, that was not the case. The other thing that happened here is in obviously 2018 and 19, China was a big factor in our exports. Most of those were bottled exports as well. So that's declined. And there's also been a long-term move for exporters to move from shipping in bottled into bulk packaging economically, for economic reasons, but also environmental reasons. So that's been a shift there as well. So turning then towards the last year, so the change from 2022 to 2023, unpackaged exports grew by 7% in volume. And that surge or that increase is really due to the fact that we couldn't get that 2021 vintage out in 22. So there's been a big increase in the year ended March 2023, getting that vintage out. And as we move further into 2023, there'll be more 2022 vintage coming into that as well. Then there's also the decline in package exports. So the increase in bulk wine, the decline in bottled wine, you can see that volume is pretty much stable there. And so the decrease in packaged wine, that's really in those lower price points that I was talking about. In some of our key markets like the UK, US, Canada, that share of the market is really declining. And you're seeing that happen there in the packaged exports. So that same trend is really playing out here by price point as well. First of all, that trend I just talked about in the packaged exports, in the bottled, that price point, the $2.50 to $4.99 price point, being down by 19% in volume. That's really where that is playing out, that trend. Then you have sort of a contradictory trend where the $2.49 and under price segment, so this is mostly bulk wine going out because it doesn't include packaging costs, it's at a lower value. You can see that's growing, but that's most likely to be a very temporary shift. As we've said, the 2022 vintage was lower. 2023 is likely to be much lower as well. So you wouldn't have thought that supply-driven adjustment is going to last too much longer. Then just quickly, I wanted to show the results by exporter size, because there is a little bit of nuance there. You can see that total exports are down by 7% in value and volume is down by 1%, but most of that is driven by the bigger exporters. And that makes sense because as you can see in the donut chart there on the left, they've got a 94% share of volume, is those bigger exporters. But what I wanted to show was there's actually some average value growth for smaller exporters and even some value growth year on year if you're in the 10,000 to 100,000 9-liter cases range. So there's actually some growth there. So, and obviously the number of exporters in those segments is a lot larger. It doesn't mean everybody in those segments is growing, but as a whole they are. So just a little bit of nuance to the figures as a whole. Then looking at red and white wine, and this is sort of the price segment profile. And what I've picked here is I've picked a few different years. I've picked 2015, 2019, and 2023. And the reason I've done that is because 2023 is now, obviously, 2015 was just pre-chapter, just pre-China taking off. And then 2019 was right where China was a large part of our figures. So looking at white wine first, there's not a lot of shift as far as a profile by price segment, but there is a little bit of premiumization there in the above 10. So shipping more white wine above $10 per liter than we were back in 2015. But down really overall compared to 2019. But then I guess the more interesting chart is the one on the left. That's the red wine. And you can see there that the 2023 line is much lower than the 2019 line overall. So we're shipping less value of red overall. But however, it's just good to see when you're comparing 2023 to 2015, there's actually been a lot of premiumization happening above 10. And both of those figures, 2015 and 2023, China would have a very small share of both of those figures. So that means in other markets across the globe, we've actually premiumized a lot in our red wine. Then looking at just comparing below $5 and above $5 a litre, you can see that the loss in export value really is at that below 5 still red wine. That's where a lot of that is coming from. There is a little bit of growth in still white wine at above $5 a litre. So the more premium whites are growing. It's only 2%, but it is on this chart. It's the only thing that is growing. And that growth actually gets stronger when you look at above 10. Of course, it is off of a small base, but that is where the growth is at the moment. And continuing on with that theme, this is looking at varieties, what varieties we export. And this is overall, this is all price points, and this is by volume. So you can see in the last year, Chardonnay has actually overtaken Shiraz as our #1 variety being exported. And that's really being driven by the US and Canada, and it's an unpackaged wine. Now, the decline in Shiraz is also driving that, and that decline is coming from the UK, the US, Denmark, Germany, New Zealand. So quite a few markets that are contributing to that decline in Shiraz. Looking then towards the premium price segments, we've got now Cabernet Sauvignon taking over for Shiraz as the #1 variety above 10. So there's a few things you can see from this chart. Cab Sav and Shiraz obviously dominate our exports above $10 a litre. Everything else is very, very small. But I think it should be noted that a lot of the premium whites are growing. So you've got Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, and Semillon all growing off of very small bases. But that's kind of telling you sort of what consumers are wanting at the moment. They're wanting those light white styles. The growth in Cab Sav is being driven by Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Some of the markets that I'll talk about in a second. And the decline in Shiraz is also driven by Hong Kong and Singapore and the US. So that's why that shift has happened there. There's the markets driving that. Then just looking at the export value share across regions. And actually right now in 2023, things are pretty even between North America, Europe, and Asia. So from a diversification point of view, that's actually quite positive that we've got value going pretty evenly to these regions. And, that little bit of an increase to other as well. So just showing a little bit about diversification there. The other thing that's apparent on this chart is how much, Asia had a large share back in 2018, 19, and 20, and how that's then kind of balanced out in the last couple of years, with North America and Europe regaining quite a bit of share there. And obviously a little bit of a decline there in the last year for Europe from 33% to 30%. And that's because of this next slide here. You can see that Europe declined by 17% in total. So that's really the big factor affecting our exports at the moment. You've got North America down by 5%, as well as Northeast Asia. And then the growth is actually coming from Southeast Asia. So that's up by 9%. And overall, we exported to 118 destinations, and that was up from 112 the year before. So really just recovering a little bit after COVID, where we couldn't export to as many destinations or get into market as much as we wanted to. So looking at the top 10 markets by value and by volume, you can see there, so overall value is down by 7%. You can see the big drag on that figure is really the UK at the moment. It's down by 20%. That's a big impact on our exports. Also down US and Singapore. So that's also affecting the figures there. Over on the volume side, you've still got a decline in the UK, but the US and Canada has seen a big increase in volume. So that's kind of weighing that out. And that's in unpackaged wine. And so what you get is that it outweighs itself, but you don't get the same effect in value. And that is because it ships, unpackaged wine ships at a lower average value because it doesn't include packaging costs. And there's also been a decline in the average value of unpackaged wine. So you don't get that same boost in value that you do in volume. And so that's why we're getting those different trends by volume and value overall. So just turning now to more detail on our sort of traditional markets. For this presentation, I've defined that as the UK, US, and Canada. There are more that we would define as our traditional markets, but I've only got a limited amount of time. So I will stick to those for the purposes of this presentation. So just going first to the UK, obviously the biggest effect on our numbers right now. What we've got here is export value. And I've put in a timeline of some of the things that have happened in the UK market in the last 6 years, I guess it is. And it's been very, very turbulent. It's been very hard to determine what a normal amount of exports to the UK is. And that is because of two factors. We've got Brexit and we've had COVID. So the Brexit referendum happened in 2016. After that, we did see a bit of a dip in exports because everybody was a bit unsure about what was happening with this market. Then the 2-year process that kicked off in 2017, and we started seeing a build up of exports to the UK so that exporters could get in before things got difficult, before the paperwork changed, before all of that admin. So that then we had that build up between 2017 and 2019, and that then we had the withdrawal deadline was extended. So we had a dip in exports after that because everybody had front loaded already. They'd already gotten their product into market. Then 2020 arrived, and you have the UK officially leaving the EU, and then you also that coincided with the first COVID-19 case being detected in the UK. And after that, we had a huge amount of wine going into the UK. And it's partially because of this. We had 1 year before the transition period ended for Brexit, but also because we are #1 in the off-trade in the UK. And obviously, on-trade shut down, and people, consumers, they gravitated towards those big brands available in the off-trade, of which we have a lot. Australia actually has a 24% share of the off-trade there. So there was a big, again, build-up of wine going into the UK, basically between January 2020 and through to May 2021. And that's where the Brexit transition ended and the on-trade opened back up. And since then, we've seen the exports decline to the UK. Now, we're sort of back to where we were pre-Brexit, but we wouldn't expect it to really, this to be the floor quite yet. As most of us know, there's a terrible economic situation going on in the UK, as well as additional duties on wine that are being implemented or coming into force in August this year. So we would expect that this number, it hasn't quite flattened out yet, hasn't bottomed out. What that number is, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I would expect this number to keep decreasing, at least in the short to medium term for the UK. So just looking then at our off-trade data in the UK, you can see that, so I've got the orange lines are total, red is Australia, and the green line, I've just put export volume on there as well. You can see then that build-up of sales that happened in 2020 and into 2021. And this same trend happened in the US as well, but it was much more shortened. So, and whereas in the UK, it was a much longer period. And maybe that's because they had more restrictions than the US. People were slower to go back to the on-trade, but it definitely kept going much longer than people expected. And then, of course, into 2022 and 23, we've had a decline. What's good is that Australia has actually declined by less than the total market. So our market share has actually increased because the total market is declining more than Australia is. So that's one positive there. And why is that? So again, this is off-trade data. And if you look at the right-hand side, you've got the price point share of our sales in the market versus the total market. You can see we have a large part of our sales is in that £6 to £7 per bottle, to the blue section there. We've got that's a 33% share of our sales. And if you look then on the left, and that same price segment, you can see that Australia is growing, but the rest of the market is declining. So that's a large part of our sales where we are growing, and where Australia is growing, and the total market is declining. But in addition to that, if you look at the higher price points, although it's off very small bases, we're also growing between 10 and 20 pounds and above 20 pounds per bottle. So that's what's helping us kind of outpace the market at the moment. Okay, so that's the UK. Moving to the US, this is volume and value of exports to the US over the last few quarters. And what you can see is that unpackaged volume is that pinky purple column. And that's what's really pushing growth at the moment. So that's exporters finally being able to get that 2021 vintage and the 2022 vintage into market. You can see that the value of both packaged and unpackaged has declined a bit in the last quarter. And you can also see that decline in the packaged volume. So those are the two forces that are playing out in the US market at the moment. So overall, for the year ended March 2023, exports to the US declined by 8% in value, but increased by 15% in volume. So those are those two forces playing off of each other there. However, if you take a more long-term view of exports, and this is above $10 a litre, so the more premium side of things, a small part of what we export there, but you can see that since 2013 up to now, volume in this price segment has grown by about 3% a year. So it's just a gradual, steady growth. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is the part of the market in the US that's growing. The rest of the market is declining in the US. You can see in these figures here, in 2021, this part of the market really had a setback due to that, mostly due to COVID. There was, again, consumers were gravitating towards the bigger brands. The on-trade was shut, which is where a lot of the more premium brands are sold. So it took a hit in 2021 and then rebounded really strongly in 2022. And it has then declined a little bit in 2023. And so we'll see what happens in the coming months. Just looking at the number of exporters to the US, very stable in the last couple of years, but much of an improvement compared to the years previous. We're at 297, which is very close to the 300 number in 2009. So that's right when the GFC hit and exports started to come down. So we've kind of reached that point now to the US, but obviously still a bit of a way to go to get back to where Australian exports were back in 2006 to 2008. Okay, and then looking at just some retail data for the US as well. On the right-hand side, you've got our, just like I did for the UK, it's our share of sales by price segment. So Australia is the blue line. You can see that over 80% of our sales are in that $4 to $8 price segment. And so that is really what's driving our performance currently in the US. If you look at the chart on the left, you can see that the popular segment, so the $4 to $8 per bottle segment, is declining by 8% in the latest figures for the total market. And similarly, Australia in that price segment is down 6%. And that's our big price segment. So that's what's driving our retail figures. It's also driving our export figures. That's the reason behind it. There's a couple other things on the chart on the left that I thought were interesting, and that's that the total market between $15 and $25. Obviously, that is where the growth is for the market. But in the last couple quarters, you can just see that growth has come off just a little bit. So only up by 2% and 5% in the latest figures. And that could be an indication of consumers trading out because of economic reasons, reduced disposable incomes. We don't see anyone trading down. There's no evidence of that in the data at the moment. There's no increase in the lower price segments. And so what we're hearing is that they still like those price segments, the 15 to 25. That's still where the growth is, but they're just choosing to just drink a little bit less of it. However, if you look over to the Australian figures, there's actually some really good growth between 15 and 25 at the moment. And obviously off of a very small base, mostly driven by Cabernet Sauvignon. But yeah, just some good signs of growth there off very small bases, but still something positive to look at. Okay, and then just turning to Canada, the trends in Canada are very similar to those in the US, but just really more accentuated. So you can see again that purple line, the purple column, that's unpackaged volume. You can see that growth in the last few quarters going to Canada. And then value of unpackaged has not grown by as much. So you've got that average value coming down. Again, packaged volume and value are also declining. And so you've got a greater share of unpackaged exports going in. So that meant that exports to Canada grew by 2% in value in the last year, but 44% in volume. So again, a big change, but still growth in value there. And so we've still got some good growth happening in the premium end for Canada. So above $15 a litre was up by 39% for the year. So there's still some good growth there above 15. So just looking at the Canadian market as a whole, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadians actually started drinking a lot more wine, as you would. And so per capita consumption actually increased. But pre-pandemic, what was actually happening is that wine was losing share to other beverages. So such as craft beer, craft spirits, and RTDs were doing really well. And so it seems like we're going back to that trend now in Canada. Australia is performing, this is year-ended February figures, sales figures. Australia is performing pretty much the same as the market, really. So it's the market that's coming down. Still have an 8% share. But yeah, they're losing wine drinkers in Canada. They are not recruiting, they're having a hard time recruiting the younger generation to drink wine. And there's a lot of focus on health and wellness. So just the same sort of trends we're seeing in other developed wine markets around the world. So on that note, we're going to look at the emerging markets for a second. What this chart here is showing you is the change in the number of exporters by market for about the top 20 markets. And obviously, the few things that stand out are the decline in exporters to Hong Kong and mainland China. Obviously, the UK as well. If you look at volume and value decline, it doesn't surprise you too much that there's less exporters as well. Exporters to the US and Singapore and the Nordics are quite stable for the moment. But then what I really want to highlight is there's some really key emerging markets that are increasing in the number of exporters. You've got France there, which is an interesting one, but you've also got Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, India, and Vietnam, all increasing in the number of exporters. So most of those are in Southeast Asia. So that's where I'm going to finish off my presentation in a second. But yeah, also to India. As well, so, and Japan. So looking at Southeast Asia, it's a really diverse group of markets. It's home to more than 686 million people. So that's about 9% of the world's population as a group. So it represents pretty significant opportunity for Australian wine, and it's close to home as well. So Singapore is really the only market in this group that the IMF classifies as an advanced economy. The rest of them are classified as emerging economies. And what that means is that they currently have lower GDP per capita levels, but they're expected to grow a lot more over the next few years. Now, the economies of these markets were heavily impacted by COVID-19 due to their reliance on inbound tourism. But in more recent months where inflation has been hitting us all, the inflation in these markets has actually been a lot more muted compared to other markets. So if you can see here on the screen, this is total wine consumption. This is not just our exports, it's our total wine consumption in Southeast Asia. And it's worth about 6.7 million 9-liter cases of wine, which is worth about 1.4 billion US dollars. So that was in 2021. They've got a pretty high average value going to these markets as well. And wine consumption really fell, as you can see, in 2020. And that was due to the fact that most of the wine consumption is done currently by tourists. There was a little bit of a rebound in 2021, but then it's expected to then keep growing now out to 2026 as well, and about 7% per year it's expected to grow now. And that is because there's rising incomes, also a return of tourists, and this growing appetite of some really good quality alcohol that's in these markets. So looking at our exports then, you can see that pre-COVID, there was a bit of a slow trend upwards. Then that really declined during COVID, and now has rebounded super strongly. So the total region was up by 9% in the last 12 months. And all of the destinations grew in volume. Singapore was the only destination to decline in value, and that was by 20%. But Singapore does remain #1 destination in this region for Australian wine exports. But it is a trading hub. So some of the wine that is shipped into Singapore is then re-exported out again to places such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So can be hard to read because changes in Singapore and Hong Kong and the UK can vary depending on business practices of whether you're shipping directly to a market or whether you're shipping through that hub. So the main contributors to the growth were Thailand and Malaysia, but there was also growth across the whole price spectrum. So the lower end and the higher end both grew to this region. So that's really good to see that that's spread across many different businesses. And there was 462 exporters to the region, which was up 8% from the previous year. So just honing in a little bit on Singapore, it's the largest wine market by value in Southeast Asia. And the wine market in Singapore is fairly well developed compared to the other destinations in the region. However, Singaporeans only drink 2.6 liters of wine per annum. So if you compare that to Australia, that's about a tenth of what Australians drink. So still a lot of room to grow there. IWSR is forecasting about a 3% growth per annum in the next 5 years. And Australia is really well placed to take advantage of that growth. So we're ranked number one in sales. That's ahead of France, Chile, and Italy. And then perceptions of Australian wine, like you can see on your screen here, have been increasing as well. So that quality perception is up to 7.85 out of 10 by Australian wine drinkers in Singapore. And then we're also widely associated with having a wide variety of wines and being food friendly. So, and then attributes like expensive and fine, sustainable, innovative, those are also growing as well. So that's just a really good base for us to grow from. Then going to Thailand. It's an emerging wine market. Consumption is driven by tourists at the moment, and that consumption did fall during 2020, as it did in the rest of the region. So it fell by 23% in 2020 and has slightly recovered. So IWSR is forecasting that wine consumption in Thailand is going to hit 2019 levels in 2024. So and that's roughly the same as the OECD's prediction that tourism will also recover by 2024. So they're kind of going hand in hand there. So again, we're really well placed in the market. We're number one by volume and value, ahead of Chile, Italy, and France. And in the last 12 months, our exports increased by 59%. You can see that big jump here in 2023. So that means that Thailand has actually jumped from number 11 market by value in last year to number 7 this year. So it's jumped into our top 10 as well. So obviously still red wine is quite popular in Thailand, and as such, that's how our exports break down. There's 78% red to Thailand, obviously Cab Sav and Shiraz being the more popular varieties that are driving growth. And then lastly, just having a look at Vietnam as well. So unlike Singapore and Thailand, the Vietnamese wine market has a domestic category. It's about a 26% volume share. And Australia is not number 1 in this market. So we're actually 5th after the domestic category, Chile, France, and Italy. Australian wine is forecasted to grow though by 9%. And if that growth eventuates, it'll be outpacing the market and will be taking over Italy in 2023. So we'll see. Let's hope that happens. And looking at the export figures, it looks quite positive. Australian wine exports to Vietnam grew by 43% in value, and the number of exporters actually went up by 54% to now over 100 companies exporting to Vietnam. And again, most of the exports are red as well, because that's what's mostly popular in the market. However, like a lot of markets, beer is very popular, but a beer actually has a 99% market share in Vietnam of the alcohol category. So it is that's a big mountain to climb. And so it is. There's quite a few competitive factors in the Vietnamese market to keep an eye on. So wine is seen as a luxury product. It's reserved for special occasions and corporate gifts, but it's still a very interesting opportunity for us in that market. So just in summary, what I've shown you today is that global wine supply and demand are out of balance. And that is because of this slight decline in demand that we've seen just over the last few years. This is disproportionately impacting on lower price segments, and that's where Australia plays in the exports for the most part. Most of the decline is in lower price red wines, but some of the premium whites are showing really good growth. As far as markets, the UK has had a really few turbulent years, and it's a while away from really recovering. Unpackaged exports are driving growth to the US and Canada, but we're all seeing some very small growth, big growth off small bases in some of the premium price segments. And then for the emerging markets, they offer a really interesting opportunity for diversification. Most of it currently is in Southeast Asia, but there's other markets such as Brazil as well that offer an interesting opportunity. A lot of this data is available on the export dashboard that you can get on the Wine Australia website. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions you've got.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Angelica. And I think, gosh, you jam-packed a lot of information into 45 minutes. So those that are online with us today, and Angelica will be with us for a few more minutes. So send those questions in to us now through that Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. But I imagine that, you provided that sort of whole of the market insight and Australian wine businesses going, oh, that explains why I'm seeing this happen and that happen within their own businesses. So thank you again for your time today. I jotted down a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. Where you refer to like the market share declining just in general, is Australia's share being replaced by other wine producing countries, or is it really being replaced by alternative alcoholic, non-alcoholic beverages?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple factors going on. So consumers are moderating alcohol.
Yeah.
So in general, they are consuming less of it. However, there are certain categories in certain markets that are doing really well. So you've got, craft spirits and RTDs doing really well in a lot of different markets. So that is taking away share from the wine category as a whole.
Yeah.
Right. So you see the overall in volume, the amount of wine being sold in some of the more developed markets declining. And then obviously Australia is then, because we're on that lower price segment where all the decline is happening, that's really impacting on us. Yeah. But then the premium price segments are growing, but it's such a small share of what we export. So it's not having the same, it's not having the same impact that it might have for some more premium, where some source countries that have a more premium profile,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my other question for you, or just found it interesting. You spoke quite a bit about that unpackaged exports and how there's a rise in that. And I was pleased to hear from environmental perspective. Obviously lighter weight, efficiency makes sense from a shipping perspective. When that bulk gets to its destination, is it ultimately going into like by our own brand, or are we seeing that producers are actually getting it bottled under their own brand and label in market?
There's a combination of both.
Yeah,
definitely.
I guess
going
the bigger.
On. Yeah, depending on what your business practice business model is. There's definitely some bigger producers that export, then they bottle it under their own brand and sell it, and that's what works for them. Then there is definitely some of that going on where it's going into that sort of private label stuff. So both are definitely happening at the moment. I don't think that's going to go away much, but it is interesting that we've got this is pushing by supply at the moment, the unpackaged growth, but then we do have in most markets that decline in the lower end. So I wouldn't expect that to keep happening for too much longer, because it is supply driven.
Another key takeaway for me was Chardonnay is the new Shiraz.
There you go.
Which for some people is a good thing, and others maybe not. We've got a question that's just come in from Mando. What promotional initiatives has Wine Australia planned in the next 6 to 12 months for overseas markets? It's a broader question.
There's lots and lots of things going on. Obviously, coming up now, we've got the Expo Singapore happening. So that'll be really exciting. That's in May coming up. So that'll be really good, especially as I showed you, the data for Southeast Asia is quite good at the moment. So it's really exciting opportunity. In the US, we're very focused on the market. The market entry program there, which is kind of a tailored program for exporters wanting help entering the market. Also across all markets, we're very focused on the Australian Wine Discovered education platform as well, which is excellent. If you haven't been on there, take a look. And then, of course, in Europe, we've got our normal events planned for
and obviously Pro Wine has just happened. And sounds like it was a huge success for Australian wine as a whole. So hopefully we see those those sales feeding through in the export data in the coming months. Fingers crossed. Excellent. Okay, well, I don't think we have any further questions. Thank you again for your time today.
No problem.
And just a reminder to everybody who's online that our next webinar will be held on Tuesday, 13th of June. And we have Christian Campanella from Pernod Ricard Winemakers presenting, and he's the HR Communications and SR Director there. So something a little bit more on leadership, people management. It should be a great one to tune into. So keep an eye out on our website when registration's open. For all WCA members, recordings from today's and past webinars are stored on the WCA website in the education section. So when you get some time, check that out. And as always, if you have any ideas, feedback on topics you would like to see in our webinar program, please don't hesitate to email me directly, wca@winecommunicators.com.au. Thanks again to everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.